Hi folks, Mr. Anthem here today with another quick lesson on how to render realistically in Photoshop. I'm going to show you how you can use, one, the brush settings to give yourself a very quick and easy brush that will be effective at blending colors together. And two, I'm going to show you how you can use the eyedropper tool to select pigments together on a digital canvas and blend them together. Now this is a workflow that you can use in Procreate or Krita or Clip Studio Paint. What I want you to consider though is that we're not painting realism necessarily, but more so how to consider to bring two colors, values, or pigments on a canvas and blend them together as if it were color pencils that were overlapping wet on wet oil paints. So this is something that you can apply to any style. Now with that in mind, let's get started. Before we start, if this is your first time doing anything in Procreate or Photoshop, all of these default brushes could be overwhelming. Let's take care of that and give you a good brush to start off with. Take the default hard round brush and open up brush settings to change a few settings. On brush tip shape, set the angle to about 50% and roundness somewhere between 50 to 60%. On shape dynamics, click on Control and set it to pen pressure, and then set minimum diameter to somewhere around 50 to 55%. On transfer, set opacity to pen pressure, and then click smoothing. Changing these few settings will give an organic feeling and pleasant brush to use. You should notice that the brush flows and moves with the weight of your hand quite well. The harder you press, the darker your marks, the lighter, the lighter. Mess around with it. Start with a blank canvas and give yourself a new layer to draw on. Start with your new brush that we just made and start to block in some of values from left to right, from dark to light. If you've done value scale in drawing class, this should look familiar. Make it look something like this, and if it takes a few tries, that's no problem. If it's easier to work smaller, you can scale it up like this once you're done. When you have an even transfer of value from dark to light, select an area like this using the selection tool, invert it, and then remove the rest. Now we're going to start to blend our values together using the same brush and also the eyedropper tool. The eyedropper tool selects any color or pigment on your canvas that you select. You can do this by holding Alt to bring up the eyedropper. Tap on the value you want, release Alt, and then you can start to paint with the value that you just selected. You'll notice that I'm constantly refreshing the pigment that I'm grabbing with the eyedropper tool. And the reason why is I'm trying to get these values as close together as possible and overlapping them. It's better to do pigments and values and colors that are right next to each other and bring them forward and bring them backwards into one another. Now, you'll notice too that I'm leaving behind some brush marks. That's okay. Using a hard edge brush like this is going to have strokes and marks show, but this can create a more traditional look if you learn how to control it. Repeat this process with the blending brush in my brush pack that you can find in Google Classroom. Again, instructions for installing it are super straightforward. And then repeat the process a third time using a brush of your choosing. Experiment with something that looks interesting in the brush selection tool. Let's speed up and look at a character design that I brought into Photoshop. That's in the early construction stages, roughly blocking in shadow and light. Think of it like that, shadow and light. You can see where I laid down my shadows, and just like how we practiced, I'm using the eyedropper tool to select a value that is slightly darker to start and build up the darker parts of this portrait. We're going to lay these values in the shadowed areas where it's appropriate and slowly blend the edges of these values together. Try not to stray too far from the value you're painting on though. Keep it close to the value scale and take your time. Rushing through this part of the process can make your painting look muddy. Now why does that happen? Well, we need to think about our drawings and paintings as a bunch of forms. The human face is full of them. If we look at this mustachioed looking medieval gentleman that I drew off the, I don't know, some fantasy character, I wanted to have this large metal helmet that covers his eyes. It's very low on his head, but then we have this prominent nose sticking out from under it into the light. We have this large mustache and these chops and going across his face, covering his mouth. And then underneath that is a large chin. It's important to keep all of these forms distinguished from one another, and we need to blend and unify the values within the forms. Here, I'm going to start working on the nose and blending it up into the helmeted area, but I'm blending these values together and trying to keep it separate from the highlight that is the tip of his nose. Does that make sense? Bringing in the shadowed area into the tip of the nose or this highlight across his cheek, that's when the painting starts to look muddy, when we can't distinguish between shadow and light anymore. That's actually why I'm not using a soft round brush or an airbrush to sort of blend in my values together. I'm using this smaller pencil-like brush to sort of sketch in and add texture to my painting as well, while still holding to the rules that I'm setting for myself. Don't use values that are too light or too dark compared to the ones that they're next to, and blending the values within these specific forms. On the neck, for example, I want to keep the sinews and the muscles kind of separated from one another to give the neck a lot of dimension and then a lot of form. Now let's skip forward to a portrait that is in a bit of a further along rendering process. Here I'm starting to really kind of blend and render the values together and to create a bit of a more realistic style. Now, when I'm considering the light and the dark across this woman's face, I want to make sure that, as I've said over and over again, that I'm not blending my forms into one another. If I were to overblend, let's say, this lower eyelid or upper eyelid into one another, then the eye itself would look flat. So let's take a look at some of the planes. If we look at the plane of the eye, we have our brow, which in this case goes over the front eyelid, and then the bottom eyelid itself. This kind of gives it a very angry expression. Then the bridge of the nose, as well as the lower tip of the nose, and then the nostrils, and how that blends into the cheekbone. This area I'm very happy with, but I'm trying to be very considerate about where light would bounce and where light would hit on top of this cheekbone underneath it. So to wrap up, before we meet again on Wednesday for our live lesson, what I need from you are 3 value scales. The first with the brush I showed you how to make, the second with the brush I'm going to have you download off of Google Classroom, and the third with the brush of your choosing. Pick something from the brush pack that looks interesting. One of the default brushes, it could be the cloud brush, it could be the tree brush, whatever. Have fun with it. And try to blend in those values together as effectively as you can. If some of the brush and some of the strokes show through though, that's okay, because some of those hard edge brushes, you can't get rid of those. But like I said, that can create a more traditional look if you're going for that sort of thing. On Wednesday, we're going to practice this workflow working with things that we know. If you play hockey, I'm going to have you draw a hockey stick 10 times in a row. If you are a gamer, maybe it can be your Xbox controller. You're just going to pick something that you're familiar with, and then we are going to draw that thing 10 times with different angles and considering how we can use light and dark to build up the forms on it a little bit. So, I hope you all have a good day, and I'll see you next time.